Hi guys, welcome back to Mysteries Channel. Thank you so much for clicking on the video. I really do appreciate it. Today we're going to continue with our series on war and we're going to talk about some interesting thoughts. Perhaps. It's tied to a very crazy part of history that's so mysterious and it was just recently discovered. I mean recently 2015, but I'm going to talk about it today. So let's go over it. My question to you is, do you think it's possible that if the vast majority of women died out in society, something crazy would happen where we would come back and perhaps take over and be the rulers of society? Like instead of it being a patriarchy, would it then become a matriarchy? It doesn't make any sense, right? It just seems like it doesn't make sense. Let's just say of the 8 billion people in the world, 4 billion are men, 4 billion are women, and 3 billion of the women die out, leaving 1 billion women left. Do you think we would restructure our entire society to help enhance those women for the benefit of the species? And what would that look like? It's something interesting to think about, and it's something that has happened in society several times. And it doesn't look the way you think it's going to look. At least it does not look the way I thought it was going to look. It's kind of the exact opposite of what I thought it was going to look like. What we are talking about today is an event that occurred between 9,000 and 7,000 years ago. Scientists aren't exactly 100% sure if it was a 2,000 year span or if it was within that time period, but it's a massive genetic bottleneck that limits the diversity of the male species of Homo sapiens in a big way. That's right, guys, men die out and they die off in large numbers. Drops in genetic diversity among humans, it's not unheard of. We've talked about it several times on this channel alone, you know what I mean? There have been times where as a species, we've come like that close to just completely being wiped out. This usually results from catastrophes that happen, massive big scale events that happen that wipe humans out, you know? Shrink the population and therefore the gene pool. But what I'm talking about today, it's known as the Neolithic Y chromosomal bottleneck. And it's a head-scratching mystery, and it has been since its discovery in 2015. Now, the concept of World War Zero is controversial. Not that many people are into it. I'm not even that into it. But nothing else really seems to fit. Now, that being said, let's kind of go over what we're talking about here. Remember that time when Homo sapiens almost died out? We were down to 40 breeding pairs. There was another such event that occurred, but it only happens to men. So many men die out that there are 17 women for every 1 man on Earth. This event spans continents: Europe, Africa, Asia. Men are just disappearing in droves, completely wiped out. The population's decimated. Every explanation you can think of has been suggested for the collapse of the male population, including disease, catastrophe, cultural changes, and finally, all-out war. So researchers decide to run simulations through supercomputers to see which hypothesis was the most likely cause. Now, to test their theory, they conducted 18 simulations, which they created different scenarios for the bottleneck that includes factors such as Y chromosome mutation, competition between groups, male-related diseases, catastrophes, and any other reason that brings on death that you can think of. Their simulations showed that warfare between patrilineal groups could have caused the so-called Y chromosome bottleneck because members of one familial group would have a very similar Y chromosome, and if they went and wiped out group B, it would limit diversity, and this would have occurred over and over and over again. War. Now, it is worth noting that when researchers ran simulations in which patrilineal groups did not exist, the bottleneck never occurs. No trace of it. It's bizarre. And when we look at the genetic record of all other species on Earth, you just don't see males dying out like that. It's a head scratcher for sure, because you just don't think a war could be that freaking crazy bad where almost all the men die. And I know you're like, is that even possible? Is there any evidence? I mean, World War I and World War II weren't even like that. You're right. But there is a war in recent history that was like that, and it's one of the most brutal things I've ever read in my life. This war is called the Paraguayan War. It begins in 1864, and this is kind of a very loose breakdown of what happens. South America is in turmoil. Uruguay has some stuff going on, and Paraguay kind of gets involved, end up going against the powerhouses of Argentina and Brazil. War breaks out. At the beginning of their war, they are enlisting in their military camps men between the ages of 25 and 55. They have 80,000 men in 1864, and within a year, they are down to 40,000 men. Common sense would dictate that, you know what, seems like we're kind of losing the war. Maybe we stop, but that's not what happens. No, they decide that they're going to expand the age group. Anyone between the ages of 12 and 60 are now part of this war effort. I won't go through the entirety of it, but basically there were entire regiments of 12-year-olds, 12-year-olds through 15-year-olds. There were entire regiments of just children completely wiped out. On top of the men, by the end of the war, there were only 6,000 men of military age left. Now, the end of the war kind of looks like this. They're making a push trying to make it north, this one northern stronghold. At the very beginning of this push north, I'm just going to call it a death march because that's what it is. It was a death march. At the beginning of this death march, they had about 20,000 men, and it wasn't just men. Women and children under the age of 12 were also on this march, helping the men fight. The women were beasts of burden, carrying ammunition, tents. They were cooking. Children were also running ammunition out to men that were fighting in the field or trying to hold up the back line of this. By the time they got from the beginning of their march to the end, that 20,000 turned into 6. And on the way up, as the men are dying off, because they're worried about what would happen to their women when the other men come through, they're just shooting them on the spot. If you were to the point of starvation, if you were injured, or if your husband died, you were done too. Freaking nuts. Now, when you look at the population of Paraguay before this war occurs, some say 1.3 million, some say 400,000. One thing people will do agree on, that 90% of the males of military age 12 through 60 died. 90% of the population of males that were within child producing age are gone. It's just, it's disgusting and mind-blowing to think about, like just the bloodiness of it all. And when you read about it, it's I'm just going to say it's so beyond fucked up when you read like what was going on. It's insane. It's insane. Post-war, they actually did some counts. They kind of had to know. They had to know how bad off were they. After the war ended, 220,000 people survived. Of those 220,000 people, 106,254 were women above the age of 15. 86,079 were children under the age of 15, and 28,746 were men above the age of 15. 106,000 women, 28,000 men. It's kind of looking like the Neolithic bottleneck, but for this one country, right? Immediately after the war occurs, of course, men are a hot commodity, and exactly what you think happens. Women try to like hold them up and protect them. One, they're afraid of what's going to happen after, final defeat has happened. Are they going to come and kill the rest of them? There's not that many left. There's very few men. We're going to protect them by hiding them inside of houses and doing all the agricultural work. We're going to clean up the cities. We're going to rebuild. And that's what was happening. As this is happening, the men are getting together and they're trying to figure out what are we going to do to make sure that our society makes it. And you're never going to believe the plan that comes up. In the post-war reconstruction in Paraguay, an adoption of what became their constitution and civil and marriage codes is implemented. These legal acts exclude women from all forms of power, putting them under the tutelage of their fathers and husbands in all matters pertaining to management and or inheritance and assets. The marriage code declared that women or females are unfit to perform any and all critical roles in society, besides 2, agriculture and home production. It really represented a big, huge backward step in women's rights in Paraguay. They had much more freedom before the war occurs than afterwards. Moreover, women were not entitled to manage expenses for their household. They basically were only allowed to do 2 things, work in the field and stay in the house. They didn't even go shopping at this point in time. It was not looked at like they should even handle any kind of money at all. They were not allowed to act as witnesses in public affairs. If they wanted to perform anything at all other than housework and agricultural work, they had to get permission from either their fathers or husbands. Paraguay kind of sounds like large chunks of the Middle East currently, if you ask me. And it's the exact opposite of what I thought would happen. I would think it would be more like World War II, like what happened in America and in parts of Europe, where women got a little bit of a taste of freedom, and because they worked so hard to keep the country going as the men were off fighting, that it now opens up the door for women to say, you know what, I'm more than just a field hand and a homemaker. No, it's crazy. With only 28,000 men, women were put back down the bottom of the social ladder to nothingness, to being cattle, basically. It's kind of crazy. So I was like, God, I wonder if we can find any evidence in the ancient past with the Neolithic Y chromosomal bottleneck that might propose that something similar happened. In the last video I did, I talked about Jebel Sahaba and how around 15,000 years ago, we have what looks like the earliest warlike conflict, right? But it's not the earliest one that's recorded in history. The earliest warlike conflict that is recorded in history happens in Sumer, between Sumer and Elam. This one is said to have occurred around 2700 BCE if you buy the proposed timeline, which you know I'm not a fan of. And here is why. We're going to go over some timeline bullshit right now, in fact. Sumer and Elam, they go to war, and they are commanded by the king of Kish, a man named Enmin Baragasi. He defeats the Elamites, and it is recorded on stelae that they carried away as spoils the weapons of Elam. Friends, here's where the timeline problems begin. Enmin Baragasi is the point in which scholars state that the Sumerian kings list turns from myth into historical record. This part of it, pretend, make-believe, mythology and legend. This part of it, oh, that's 100% legit. We have proof of it right here. So, what do we know about this man, Enmin Baragasi? We do know from the Sumerian kings list that he reigned for 900 years and that he was succeeded by his son Aga of Kish, who ruled for 625 years. He is the earliest name attested directly from archaeology. And what's interesting here is that he built a temple to Enlil in a city that's dedicated to Inanna. Inanna was the sacred god of this city. This guy, Enmin Baragasi, was like, let's put Enlil's temple here. Now, Inanna is Enki's daughter. Enki is Enlil's brother. We have a little triangle going on now, don't we? It's pure speculation. But is this the switching over of one cult to another? Or dare I say, one ancient religion to another ancient religion? Could this possibly be one of the earliest religious wars? I know from the Jebel Sahaba video that the gods Zeus and Dionysus were worshipped in Meroe. These gods gave direction to the kings of where war should be brought. Oracles were set up. Their words were considered holy and divine. Those words were followed, resulting in bloodshed and empires. We all know what happens when religions are vying for the top spot in an area. It gets bloody and ugly. Now, most scholars will date Enmin Baragasi to 2600 BCE, even though the Sumer and Elam war was in 2700. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like, they don't even try to make it work. What I can tell you is that Enmin Baragasi is the 30th name on the Sumerian kings list and the 22nd name that is listed after the flood swept over. Scholars actually argue that Enmin Baragasi is the ruler of Sumer during the Great Localized Flood. I bet you know where I'm going with this. The timeline is jacked up, and this is an example of where and how numbers go funny. Now, there's a place in Sumer called Shurapak. Shurapak had a flood that occurred there, and it is dated to around 2900 BCE. Not 2600, not 2700, but closer for them so that they can make it fit, you know what I mean? So they argue that Enmin Baragasi is the ruler of Sumer during the Great Flood of Sumer. It doesn't show that way in the Sumerian kings list, and none of the laments and none of the mythology is it Enmin Baragasi. No, that goes to a man named Ubara Tutu. And after he is done ruling, it says, and the flood swept over. Ubara Tutu is also the father of a man named Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim is the Sumerian Noah. What else do we know about Enmin Baragasi? The etymology of his name may mean priest who permeated the throne, En is an honorific title, and it would not have been part of his original name. His original name would have been Baragasi. En denotes that he is ruler of a city that is dedicated to the worship of Inanna, which I find it interesting. Me. The Me refers to the decrees of the divine. Those who decreed the divine were the priests. So many feel like this man was a priest. Also, the Me refers to the secrets of civilization. And it's a list that is just random things that are needed for a civilization to work. And it's not just good things. It's all parts of a civilization. Rulership is on there. War is on there. The sound of war is on there. Different kinds of musical instruments and tools that are used to build cities are on there. It's an interesting list. I'll do my own separate video on that later on down the road. But originally, these mes were collected by Enlil, and then they were handed over to Enki, who was supposed to be the guardian of these mes. He was to broker them out to various Sumerian centers, starting with his own city of Eridu. Now, this is described in a poem that is entitled Enki and the World Power. Now, this poem details how he parcels out responsibilities for various crafts and natural phenomena to the lesser gods. Interestingly, Inanna and her father Enki discuss why she is left out. Then, alone, lacking any great function, the great woman of heaven, Inanna, comes to see her father Enki in his house, weeping to him and making her complaint to him. Enlil left in your hands to confirm the functions of the Anuna, the great gods. Why did you treat me, the woman, in an exceptional manner? I am holy Inanna. Where are my functions? Enki answered his daughter, how have I disparaged you? How can I enhance you, maiden Inanna? Maiden Inanna, I made you speak as a woman with a pleasant voice. I made you exchange its right side and left side. Jumping in here, guys, I think this is a clue. Remember, we've talked about this before. To be on the left side was not to be in favor. It's not a good thing to be on the left side of anything. God, the king, society, whatever role or whatever function, you did not want to be on the left side of it. It meant that you were at odds or you were against it. To be on the right side, that's where you wanted to be. And it very much sounds like in this poem, Enki exchanges Inanna from the right side to the left side. He continues, I clothed you in garments of women's power. I put women's speech in your mouth. I placed in your hands the spindle and the hairpin. To you, women's adornment. I settled on you the staff and the crook, with the shepherd's stick beside them. Tell me, you guys, what does it sound like? I mean, it does sound like this could be the changing over of the guard, you know what I mean? A little bit. There are a couple of other things that I want to bring up that I think are interestingly, possibly connected to this Y Neolithic bottleneck. One, it does seem like war was involved. And we can tell from Paraguay that conflict can get so crazy, intense, and bad that you almost completely kill out your population. That's number one. And number two, many archaeologists and sociologists will say that cities came as a result of agriculture. And I don't think that that's 100% true. I'm not saying that it's not true for some places, but there are many, many cities that are 100% existed before real agriculture is in place. It's not that people did not help the crops. They just didn't plant them the way that we do it now. No, they went to where crops were growing and they brought water and they enhanced the growing conditions. At the same time as the Y Neolithic bottleneck, some other things are happening on Earth. Now, we already know that Europe, Africa, and Asia took massive hits to the male population. They almost stopped existing, 17-1. That's a crazy disparity there, right? But geologically, big things were happening. This is, again, a time where it's getting colder, much colder. Guess what happens when climate gets colder? Women produce more females when they're having children. The warmer the climate, more men are born. The colder the climate, more women are born. So it's getting colder, more girls are being born. Men go off to have this massive freaking war that possibly either includes 3 continents or rolls over 3 continents. So here's something kind of crazy that can kind of show you that the war machine that we complain about today has always kind of existed. And this is a way that you can see that it's a cycle. Many scientists will say that ancient men went to war for resources. Those resources were needed for their women to be able to continue to have families and live in a way that they could survive. They go to war, they kill off more men, and they have more women. So then this man has a little bit more resources, but many more women. So what happens? It has to continue, and it happens over and over again. creating this cycle of just killing, acquiring more women. And because of the way this works out, because there are so many women left over, so few men, and there's a dwindling of resources anyway, because of the whole way the system works out, women are definitely looked at as though they have lesser value. I don't know, but I do know that when you look at severely war-torn areas, men fare badly because many of them are brutally murdered. But many times they're fighting for something that has no positive impact on their life later on at all. And they don't have a choice. And women fare terribly because after it's all said and done, they lose even more rights. And it looks like it occurs over and over and over again. And some parts of the world have never gotten past it. They're still in that same weird spot as ancient times. Anyway, I thought it was interesting, something to share and talk about. The Y Neolithic bottleneck, I feel like it's even more disturbing than the other one, because the other disasters are natural disasters. There's not a lot we can do besides to come out of it on the other side. You know what I mean? There's not a lot of planning you can do for it. It's something that happens. And if you survive, you try your damnedest to survive and keep the population going. However, the Y Neolithic one, that's our own destructive nature coming out. And even though it's terrifying, it's still crazy to think about. Anyway, what do you guys think? Do you think it's tied to one another? Can it be? I think it possibly. Yeah, I do. I think it's tied. Nothing good comes from war, you guys. I mean, nothing good comes from it. Anyway, you guys have yourselves a very great day.